Hello everyone and welcome to the second lecture podcast of the course. In this lecture, we will be introducing you to European history. I'll be giving you a quick overview of the basic structure of that history and how it is normally divided. After that introduction, we will be focusing on the Enlightenment, which defines the beginning of the modern period. I'll introduce you to some of the important figures of the Enlightenment and their revolutionary ideas. Traditionally, historians define the beginning of the modern era with the French Revolution in 1789. It is the Enlightenment and the ideas it produced which really led directly to this event, so it is crucial to our understanding of the period. I will also make my argument why coffee is the most important drink of all time, except for perhaps beer, but that's a discussion for another day. Without coffee, in my opinion, we would not have the modern world. This image you see here is of an early modern coffee shop. I'll explain in this lecture why they were so important. The learning objectives for this lecture are: number 1, understand the basic structure of European history from the late Roman Empire to the modern period. Number 2, recognize the basic characteristics of the Enlightenment. Number 3, understand the contributions of the major intellectuals during the Enlightenment. And finally, number 4, describe how Enlightenment ideas challenge traditional authority. This is Europe. This is a course about Europe. You'll notice on this map there are no outlines of any countries. This is important because it's easy for us to forget how borders and names of countries were very different in the past. And in some cases, countries didn't even exist yet. Indeed, if we go all the way back to the Roman era, none of the modern languages of Europe even existed yet. The ethnic groups who lived on the land were very different. There were very few cities beyond the area around the Mediterranean, and the rest was forested and consisted mostly of just tiny little villages. As time goes on, we will begin to see the faint outlines of familiar countries emerge, but they are still very different. Moreover, other countries won't exist until the very end of the 1800s, countries such as Germany and Italy, which are really about the same age as Canada. Let's talk about the basic outline of European history. Traditionally, historians have divided European history from roughly the birth of Jesus onward into 3 eras: the late classical era, the medieval era, and the modern era. The modern era is usually subdivided into the early modern period and the modern period, which some would say we're still living in now. The first thing you will have to understand is that these divisions in time are completely subjective and ultimately don't mean that much. Different historians would draw them in different places. And certainly the people living in these eras would not have known them as such. It's not like someone would go to bed on New Year's Eve 1499 and wake up the next day and say, "Hooray! We're not medieval anymore, we're modern." They had no idea that we would call these eras by these names. Moreover, things did not suddenly change from one era to the next. Time changes things extremely gradually. Life in Europe in the late Middle Ages, was not really that different from the early modern period. Historians with the gift of hindsight can identify certain things which are different between the eras, but the lives of everyday people really did not change much. These dates really are somewhat arbitrary. Nevertheless, here they are. The Middle Ages is usually subdivided into 3 sections, the first era being more transitory from the Roman era, and the later being more transitory to the modern era. The Middle Ages, the way you probably imagine it, with knights in shining armor and castles, mostly existed in the middle period, the High Middle Ages. Other areas overlap. The Renaissance, for example, is really a medieval phenomenon and begins around 1300, but extends into what we might consider the early modern era. Other important subdivisions, which I'll briefly discuss today, are the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and of course, the Enlightenment. Let's begin with the Romans. Beginning as early as the 8th century BCE as a small settlement along the Tiber River on the Italian peninsula, Rome would eventually turn into the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, the Roman Empire was massive and stretched from the north of Europe up to the borders of what is now modern-day Scotland, to North Africa in the south, in the east to the Holy Land in the Middle East and Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey. It was absolutely humongous. The Romans were great road builders and connected their large empire with a network of roads which in fact still underlie much of the modern highway network of Europe today. Moreover, many of the modern cities of Europe and Asia began as Roman cities. London, Paris, Istanbul, each of these cities were founded by the Romans. And wherever the Romans went, they brought their culture. Each Roman city was essentially a carbon copy of the other. So whether you were in Londinium, the Roman name for London in the far north, or Carthage in North Africa, you could still visit a public bath with indoor plumbing and hot water, or you could take in a gladiator fight in the arena. The Romans also brought their language, Latin, with them. When the Roman Empire eventually fell in the late 5th century CE, their language, laws, customs remained. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, these are all modern versions of Latin, a living legacy to an empire long gone. The other legacy of the Roman Empire is Christianity. What began as a small Jewish sect eventually spread throughout the Roman Empire and even became its official religion. The fall of the Roman Empire was not something which happened overnight. Gradually, the empire found it more and more difficult to maintain control over such a vast region. In the absence of Roman control, Europe broke up into individual Germanic kingdoms. Historians call this period the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, culture, art, and literature flourished. It witnessed the birth of universities and saw architecture and art reach new heights. During the Middle Ages, power was local and decentralized. Medieval kings were weak and relied on the support of powerful nobles to get anything done. The pyramid that you might have been taught in high school, with the king at the top, the nobles in the middle, and the peasants at the bottom, never really existed. Instead of a pyramid, a web of relationships between nobles really defined how power was shared during the Middle Ages. Historians call this power-sharing system that dominated the era feudalism. Under feudalism, nearly all medieval society was divided into three groups: those that worked, the peasants; those that fought, the nobles; and those that prayed, the clergy. In the 12th century, though, this began to change. In the resurging cities, a new group of people began to emerge in greater numbers than ever before: the merchants, the bourgeoisie, or the very beginning of the middle class. It was the beginning of the Renaissance. Beginning in the powerful Italian city-states, the Renaissance would eventually spread to all of Europe. A new class of people, educated for business but interested in the past, began to rediscover Europe's Greek and Roman heritage. The Renaissance, spread by the printing press, transformed medieval Europe into something new. While inspired by the past, Renaissance artists such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci reached new artistic heights and inspired generations. By the late 15th century, Europe had also begun to look outward. Driven by internal economic competition and cut off from the traditional trade routes to India and China by the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Europeans began to explore, looking for new trade routes. First around the Horn of Africa, then later across the ocean. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. Although he was not the first European to do so, the Vikings had in fact beat him by about 500 years, his voyage would usher in a new era of contact between the old and the new worlds. This, of course, led to terrible exploitation and the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and centuries of colonialism. Increased literacy coming out of the Renaissance brought with it increased questions. By the early 16th century, the unity of Christian Europe was shattered by the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, a former canon named Martin Luther broke with the mainstream Christian church and sparked a religious revolution that spread across the continent. European Christianity split into many different versions. On one side, there were those who kept with the old church under the Pope in Rome. They became known as Catholics. On the other side, various new Christian faiths emerged, collectively known as Protestant Christian faiths, Protestant from the word to protest. Faiths such as Lutherans, Calvinists, Baptists, Anglicans, Presbyterians. For over 2 centuries, Europeans would go to war over the best way to be a Christian. This culminated in the massive 30 Years' War, which involved nearly every European country during the 17th century, and this war saw bloodshed that would not be matched until the First World War of the 20th century. Yet increased literacy also brought about other types of questions. In the early 16th century, our knowledge and beliefs about the natural world were turned upside down and challenged by new intellectuals. New discoveries would transform what we knew about the world and the laws of nature. From Copernicus's seminal publication of De Revolutionibus in the early 16th century to Isaac Newton's laws of motion in Principia, we were beginning to understand how the universe really worked. No longer was the Earth the center of the universe. The scientific revolution, as historians refer to it, was a gradual growth of new knowledge over several hundred years and a challenge to the old intellectual authorities. Which brings us to the topic of today, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment itself was essentially an offshoot of the scientific revolution. If the scientific revolution was challenging the old established authorities and conclusions about the universe and the natural world, then the Enlightenment challenged the established ideas about the social world. It can't really be overstated how important the Enlightenment is to the modern world. Our concepts of representative democracy, human rights, equality, and the role of government all come out of the Enlightenment. The very way we think, the way we learn, and the values we hold dear in the Western world are all products of the Enlightenment. During the 18th century, these new ideas would have profound implications almost immediately. The American and French revolutions were directly inspired by Enlightenment ideals, and their leaders were, in many cases, Enlightenment thinkers. And yet this was all happening during a time in which governments were incredibly restrictive and oppressive. This is an image of Louis XIV, who was King of France for much of the 18th century. In this image, he is depicted in Roman armor and portrayed as a classical warrior, a hero, if you will. It's a form of royal propaganda of sorts. Louis was referred to as the Sun King, since all power emanates from the sun. And he was what we would call an absolute ruler with absolute power. And power he definitely had. One of the best ways of looking at Louis XIV and understanding just how powerful he was is to look at his palace of Versailles. So Versailles was built during his reign, and if you've ever been to France, it's well worth a day trip outside of Paris to see it. First of all, it's a sprawling complex, it's absolutely humongous, and it is just gorgeous everywhere you go. So the story goes that Louis wanted a new palace. He didn't like his dingy old medieval castle palace that was in Paris, and he wanted something a little bit nicer that was closer to his hunting grounds. So he said, I'd like to have a palace built right there. The problem is that it was a swamp, and his ministers advised him saying, Sire, you can't build a palace there. It's terrible land. We can't build it there. But Louis XIV was an absolute ruler, and what Louis wants, Louis gets. And so at incredible expense, requiring some of the best architectural minds and engineers of the day, they achieved the seemingly impossible and built this massive complex in a swamp. And there is no greater testament to Louis's power than the very existence of Versailles. Here you see the famous Hall of Mirrors inside Versailles. Just another example, just the incredible, lavish, and
ornate display of wealth and power that was embedded into every part of the Palace of Versailles.
If you remember what I was saying a few moments ago about medieval kings, that they were not normally powerful, medieval kings tended to be weak and needed the support of powerful noble families in order to do anything. However, this is all different by the time we get to the early modern period. A new type of king begins to emerge, one all-powerful. As the feudal system declined, so too did the need for noble warriors. Feudal relationships changed from one of service between a noble and the king to one of payments. Kings began to create their own private armies and bureaucracies loyal to themselves. By the 18th century, we see the rise of absolute kings, or what we call absolutism. And now the pyramid is true, with the king at the top, the nobles in the middle, and the peasants at the bottom. Under absolutism, the monarch rules with absolute sovereign power over the state. Now, this is different from what you might think of as a constitutional monarchy, such as what existed in Britain at the time, which was different from France, in which the power of the king was limited. Absolutism and absolute kings are associated with the concept of the divine right of kings. The idea is that God himself appointed someone to be king, and therefore you obviously can't question the king because he's been divinely appointed. And nowhere was this more true than in France during the 18th century, right during the time when the Enlightenment started to take shape.
So in review, the Enlightenment is applying the principles of the scientific revolution to political and social thought. And it is really directly tied to the scientific revolution. In many cases, it's the same people who are contributing to the scientific revolution are also contributing to the Enlightenment. People don't, categorize themselves the same way we would. I'm a scientist. I'm a politician. People didn't think of it that way. Philosophers really were just people who were interested in intellectual ideas. And so you could imagine a philosopher one day debating about the heliocentric universe and the next day talking about whether we need kings or not. Really what we see throughout the scientific revolution is this critical spirit, this questioning spirit, and above all, a real optimism about where we're going. An optimism that somehow we as humans can get it all sorted out and we'll come up with the perfect society where everyone is equal and everything is just hunky-dory. And as we already said, France was at the center of the Enlightenment. It's the philosophers in France who set the standard and really export these ideas throughout the rest of Europe. And as I had mentioned as well, there's a bit of a mixed reaction from rulers, at least initially. Some rulers across Europe embrace aspects of the Enlightenment to do with efficiencies in government and even equality under the law, as long as it keeps them still in power. Other rulers, on the other hand, will deeply distrust the Enlightenment, and probably, from a purely pragmatic point of view, they were the smart ones, because the Enlightenment obviously will lead to the downfall of absolute rulers just about everywhere. So I want to begin just by talking about some of the major writers and thinkers of the Enlightenment. So the first person I want to talk about is John Locke. He is an early Enlightenment thinker, and he really influences all the later philosophers that are to come, even though John Locke is actually not French. I just spent all this time telling you that France is at the center of it all. But I suppose John Locke, he's the one who starts it all, so maybe we shouldn't be thinking France is the end-all and be-all. In any respect, John Locke, he came up with this concept called the social contract. And it really was revolutionary in its time. It's a simple idea at its heart. The idea is that kings don't rule by divine right. They're not ruling because God appointed them into that position, but rather they rule with a bargain of sorts with the people. The bargain posits that kings have responsibilities. One of those responsibilities might be to maintain the peace of the realm, to make sure that the people are safe. They also probably should be providing justice, a fair and equitable justice system to the people. On the other side of the bargain are the people, and they have responsibilities too. Responsibility to be good citizens and to follow the law and to not get into trouble, that sort of thing. And if needed, maybe to even come and protect the kingdom by filling positions in the army, for example, during a time of war. This is the idea of the social contract. It's a balance between the people and the ruler. Now, this is revolutionary for the time because kings don't think that way. Kings don't think I have a responsibilities to my people. My people do what I tell them to do. I mean, certainly that's the way Louis XIV would have considered it. Louis XIV was l'état c'est moi. I am the state. God himself appoints me into this role. So the idea that there is some sort of bargain or a contract between the people and the king is really a new idea. And see, the thing about contracts is that if one side is not fulfilling their end of the bargain, then the other side could be justified in breaking that contract, and in this case, overthrowing a king. Now that is really where John Locke's ideas start getting us into a path that might eventually lead to revolution. John Locke is also sometimes called the father of classic liberalism. So liberalism, especially if you've taken the second half of this course, Modern Europe, liberalism during the 19th century will become a major force, one of the major sort of competing ideas on the political landscape in Europe. Now, when we talk about liberalism in the 18th and 19th century, we're not using the word the way it is used today. And this is, I would just want to emphasize this. So if I use the word liberal today, it has a particular political context. It usually means someone who is on the left side of the political spectrum, or maybe I'm even talking about a specific political party in Canada, so like the Liberal Party of Canada. But that is not how the word was used in the 18th and 19th century. So liberalism back then implies essentially the types of ideas that John Locke was originating, which is the idea that government should have limited power. So government should only be empowered to the degree that the law allows them to be, and only so that they can fulfill the end of their contract, their social contract. And thus, under liberalism, individuals have rights. And so this is the classic idea of liberalism, that we have individual rights with a small, limited government. And this new idea from John Locke will basically run under much of the Enlightenment thinking of the 18th century, and definitely will continue to be a profound force during the 19th century as well. So the next person I want to talk about is Voltaire. And Voltaire is probably the most famous person when it comes to the Enlightenment. When people talk about the Enlightenment, they usually use Voltaire as the example. Voltaire was famous in his own time. When he wasn't running away from rulers who wanted to imprison him because of his ideas, he was traveling all around Europe and hobnobbing with the rich and the famous. And spreading these crazy new ideas of the Enlightenment. So, of course, Voltaire is not his real name. He was born François-Marie Arouet, and so that was what his mother called him. But like Zendaya or Madonna or a Drake, he took on a pen name. So his name was Voltaire. He also was from the middle class, this new sort of wealthy upper middle class group of people, which so many of the Enlightenment thinkers come from. And his main ideas, and he had lots of writings, but his main ideas that we take away from are concepts like the freedom of religion. Now that would have been really revolutionary at the time. Most people thought it was detrimental to a society to have people living together who believed different things with respect to religion. It was thought that that ultimately would constantly lead to strife, and that it was better to separate people. And certainly it would be best for a state to enforce one religion. That would have been, generally thought to be a good thing. And he argued, no. It's best to have freedom of religion where everyone can worship as they choose. And following that, he also believed freedom of expression, that people should be able to say and think what they want. And he also believed in the idea of the separation of church and state. Now, there was no separation of church and state in that time. Rulers were religious. They often had very close relationships with the heads of the church. And there was no concept that they should be ruling sort of in a secular point of view, like ruling for all people regardless of their religion. But if you're going to have freedom of religion, it follows then that you need to have a state that is neutral as well, a neutral arbitrator. And so these are ideas that I would say are fundamental to all Western democracies today. We all generally, in Canada and other places, we believe in freedom of religion. We believe in freedom of expression. And we certainly believe in the separation of church and state. The next person I want to talk about is Mateska. He also has a very, very long name, which I'm not even going to read here. It's not a pen name. He's just, because his name is so long, it's just easier to call him Mateska. And he is one of the few people of the Enlightenment who is actually part of the nobility. So it wasn't all people from the upper middle class, but there were some people who were part of the old noble families. And Mateska's great contribution to the concepts being talked about in the Enlightenment was the three-part separation of powers in government. A lot of Western democracies essentially are modeled under this system, particularly the United States. The United States was, of course, a country built on Enlightenment ideas, and the American Revolution directly comes out of the Enlightenment, and the people who are organizing it were essentially people participating in these ideas, like talking about these ideas. And so the idea of the three-part separation of government is we don't have all power invested in one person. Even if that person's elected, we don't invest all power in one person. Instead, we separate the power between at least three different groups, each with checks and balances on the other. That way, any one group can't become corrupt. Or if they do become corrupt, the other two groups will have a check on their power. So under Mateska's conception, we would have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. So under the United States, the executive would be the president, say, and the legislative would be Congress. And judicial would be the Supreme Court systems. Now, under the American system, technically each of those groups is equal. They all have checks and balances on each other. So if the president is too crazy, theoretically at least, the legislative group could impeach the president and remove the president from power. However, the executive has power too. Any law that the legislative branch passes has to be signed by the executive. And in fact, the executive, the president, can in fact veto any legislation if he or she doesn't like it. So that's a check on power in the legislative. The judicial also has checks on both of the other two groups. They interpret laws, and if they also are the ones calling goals and strikes in terms of adherence to the Constitution. So each of these groups has power over the other. And we essentially see a similar type of system in Canada. We also have a Supreme Court. We also have a legislative system. The only difference is in Canada and other parliamentary democracies, it gets a little bit confusing because our executive doesn't really have much power. Our executive is not the Prime Minister, but rather the Queen. And the Queen doesn't really have power. So really, real power is invested in the Prime Minister, who is part of the legislative group. So it's a little bit more complicated in Canada, which is why some people have argued that under parliamentary systems like Britain and Canada, Australia, the Prime Minister actually has more power, relatively speaking, than a president does under a Republican system like in the United States. Next person I want to talk about is Adam Smith. So he was Scottish. Adam Smith is usually called the father of modern economics. His main contribution was just thinking about economics in general. Economics is, of course, a study of monetary policy at a macro level, so at the level of countries. And this was not something that people really thought about. They thought of business as very local, or they thought about taxes, but they didn't really think about how everything connects to one another. His basic philosophy was laissez-faire economics, which is sometimes called the invisible hand. Laissez-faire means let it go. And Adam Smith believed that the best way for an economy to be successful, for as many people as possible to be benefiting from the economy, government needs to stay out of the way. So he was, of course, reacting to mercantilism, which was the norm at the time, that countries very strictly controlled their economies. They said who you could trade with, the colonies could only trade with the mother country, etc., etc. We've talked about mercantilism in the class before. And Adam Smith said, no. The best way would be to have no rules whatsoever, laissez-faire economics. And under that, the invisible hand will keep the economy humming away. So his main book is The Wealth of Nations, where he argued that nations essentially would do best if they are existing on a free and open market, and thus some nations will be better at certain things than others. And naturally we will see specialization, and this will result in the lowest prices for things, it will result in the most efficiency in the market, and ultimately the most amount of people will be wealthy. Now, there's plenty of people who disagree with Adam Smith. Adam Smith's ideas, though, are still held as the beginning of economics. This whole discipline of economics starts essentially with Adam Smith. The final person I want to talk about is JeanJacques Rousseau, who is incredibly important, particularly because he has a huge influence on the French Revolution. I mean, his ideas were put directly into play in the French Revolution. Now, he himself didn't actually live to see the French Revolution. I suspect he might have been horrified at the things that were done using the same terms that he'd come up with. Two of his main works were The Origin on Inequality and On the Social Contract. His main idea was this concept called the general will. And in it, he sort of developed further from John Locke's social contract idea. Instead, actually said that kings actually only rule at the behest of the general will. That means that the people essentially allow the king and can withdraw that permission if they so choose. The general will is essentially the idea of almost like majority rules, essentially. So it's the collective voice of the people. Now, during the French Revolution, though, the general will do terrible things. The general will be invoked, sending people to their death at the guillotine. The general will compel people to fight in the army. All kinds of really nasty things will actually happen in the French Revolution, and they'll call it the general will. Okay, so now I want to make this argument for you that coffee is the most important substance in the modern world. And in fact, the modern world wouldn't exist without coffee. So now, if you don't have a cup of coffee, it's a good time to pause this podcast. Go make yourself a really nice cup of coffee in your social distancing. So don't go to Starbucks, because Starbucks isn't open. Make a coffee at home. If all you've got is instant, well then just make yourself an instant coffee. Because, hold on, we're now going to talk about how coffee changes everything. So coffee is an old world crop. You know, we talked about with the Columbian Exchange how all kinds of new products from the Americas came into Europe that they hadn't known before, things like chocolate, things like tomatoes or potatoes. But coffee actually is an old world product. We believe the natural coffee plant originates in Africa, probably around Kenya. And that's probably where it was domesticated for the first time. We think maybe around the 11th century or so. Now, there's a legend associated with how coffee was discovered. Apparently, a shepherd was attending to his flock of goats or sheep. There's different versions of the story. And he noticed that when they ate the red berries of this particular plant, they got very excited and danced around. And so the shepherd then tried it himself, and thus coffee was born. So when coffee houses begin to appear in Europe in the 16th century, it's not just coffee that's coming into Europe for the first time. There are also two other new drinks, at least from the point of view of Europeans, three new stimulants, and they're all sort of spreading into Europe at the same time. There's coffee, and then there's tea, of course. Now, tea comes from Asia, and it's thousands of years old, but it was new to Europeans, and it begins to come into Europe around the exact same time. And another stimulant drink, and I say drink, is chocolate. For the vast majority of chocolate's history, it was a drink, a beverage, very like coffee. Cacao, which is the plant from which chocolate is made, contains theobromine, and theobromine is a related compound to caffeine. It has a similar effect on the human nervous system. It's not quite as strong, but it is a stimulant beverage. And so before it was turned into a solid and sweetened with sugar, chocolate at its heart is a very bitter beverage, not unlike coffee. In any respect, all three of these beverages are beginning to circulate into Europe at the same time. It'll be coffee, though, that will ultimately be the most successful and be the one with the biggest influence. So it's first introduced to Europe around in the 1500s. And it came into Europe vis-a-vis the Islamic world. So if we imagine coffee being domesticated in Africa sometime around the 11th century, it spreads throughout Africa and then into the Islamic world sometime probably in the late Middle Ages. and then Europeans would have experienced it somewhat later. It spread very quickly. Once it enters into Europe, we start seeing coffee houses pop up all over the place. By the mid-17th century, all the major cities have several coffee houses. So here's an image of a coffee house in the Islamic world. This is a 16th century manuscript of men drinking coffee. Coffee was successful in the Islamic world, partially because it's a beverage that's not alcohol, because alcohol, of course, was prohibited for most Muslims. And coffee was something that was permitted. And in fact, it was so successful that it even, some have argued, is the reason why we started to see a greater emphasis on night prayers in some Islamic sects. And here you see an image of a European coffee shop with lots of men in white wigs enjoying their cup of joe. One thing to note is that there's no women in this image. And indeed, although it's a little bit confusing whether women were allowed or not allowed into coffee shops, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but coffee houses were predominantly a male cultural phenomenon in Europe. So when coffee first begins circulating in Europe, it causes a lot of controversy. People don't really know what it is, what this substance does. There's all kinds of crazy ideas. Some people believed it was an aphrodisiac. Others believed it caused impotence. You notice here on the right side, the women's petition against coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconveniences accorded to their sex from the excessive use of that drying, enfeebling liquor. Essentially, this was an argument that women were pissed off that their husbands were drinking coffee, and thus they weren't able to perform their husbandly duties. Were women forbidden from coffee shops? Well, there's a lot of scholarly thought about this. Maybe, maybe not. We think likely that women above a certain social standing would have not wanted to be seen in a coffee shop. That it would have been sort of more, would have been considered uncouth for them to appear in a coffee shop. Whereas women below a certain station, it didn't really matter. But we do have some examples of even women owning coffee shops. So we think that it certainly wasn't a blanket policy. In fact, for women during the early modern period, tea will ultimately become a much more important drink than coffee, partially because of this association with coffee being something that is, an intoxicant or a dark liquor. Sometimes it was associated with the devil. So there was a lot of really strange ideas floating around about coffee in the early days. But one thing that I think is underappreciated about what coffee did for Europe at that time was the beginning of night culture. You see, this is the very first stimulant beverage that Europeans have had access to. Traditionally, Europeans drank two things. They drank water and they drank beer. And they drank a lot of beer. Beer during the Middle Ages was considered safer than water, and in many cases it was, because the process of making beer would actually kill a lot of the microbes and nastiness that you might just find if you're drinking water out of a stream running through London, which would be pretty darn gross during the Middle Ages, let me tell you. So beer actually was a safer drink for most Europeans, and everybody drank it. They drank it for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner. Kids drank beer. Now, obviously, the beer that they were drinking was a much weaker beer than we would have, probably about 1 or 2%. But let me tell you, if you're just spending your day drinking beer, you're not going to have a scientific revolution. You're going to be, kind of like, I'm going to take it easy. Coffee changes things a little bit because in the night now we have an ability to stay up. And some people have argued that night culture doesn't really exist to the same degree until coffee comes into play. So with this beginning of night culture, coffee becomes controversial for another reason, and that's that people are getting together in coffee shops. And what are they talking about in there? Maybe they're talking about revolution, or they're talking about, just things that kings would rather people not be talking about. In fact, Charles II, you see a picture of him there, tried to shut down all coffee houses in the country in 1675 in England. Now, you remember Charles II, his father, Charles I, had his head cut off. So he was arguably, a little bit nervous about what people might be talking about in coffee shops. The problem for Charles is that coffee houses were so popular, even his own ministers attended coffee houses. He said coffee houses were places where the disaffected met and spread scandalous reports. In any respect, his plan to shut down coffee houses did not work. So the reason why Charles II had such a tough time shutting down coffee houses is because they had become a communication hub. It's in coffee houses that you would go to hear news from abroad. coffee houses had become essentially the equivalent of an 18th century internet. That's what many historians have described it as. They were places where unregulated academic discussion and exchange of all sorts of ideas could take place. And all of the major thinkers of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment patronized coffee houses. You could, in fact, argue that the scientific revolution took place in coffee houses. This is where the ideas were hashed out. Take, for example, Principia, which is Isaac Newton's seminal work, which is, for most scholars, the pinnacle of the scientific revolution. In Principia, the major theories of the laws of motion and gravity were laid down, and it's because of Principia that we were able to land people on the moon and that we have satellites in space, and why, in fact, we have the internet of the 21st century. That's all because of Principia. According to one story, he didn't come up with Principia because an apple fell on his head from a tree. He came up with it drinking coffee with his buddy Edmund Halley, who you see there, in 1684, that Edmund Halley gave Newton the initial idea for Principia in a coffee house. So it's coffee that we have to thank, not an apple, but coffee. Edmund Halley, by the way, was famous in his own right for his own contributions to the scientific revolution. You may have heard of Halley's Comet. That's the comet that he discovered, which comes by, every 67 years or something like that. Coffee houses actually eventually started to specialize in certain topics. So you would know that if you went to one coffee shop, you might get lectures on physics, or another coffee shop, everyone who was into mathematics would gather to talk about things. So for instance, you see a picture there of the Marine Coffee House, which was a popular London venue for mathematics lectures. In fact, at the time, coffee houses sometimes became known as penny universities, because you could go into a coffee house in Oxford or London, and for paying the price of a cup of coffee, a penny, you could get an education. So coffee houses were becoming more and more important to the idea of modern exchange of these new themes. So coffee houses didn't just become important for places to learn about science or the new ideas about the Enlightenment, but coffee houses also became business hubs as well. London coffee houses in particular became centers for trade and commerce. It's in coffee houses that you could go to find business partners or investors for your new idea. And you would know that in coffee houses you would find other like-minded people where you could trade shares in a company. Coffee houses became places where you could find the current shipping news. So what's coming into port? Should I buy coffee or should I buy sugar? Can I sell it at this rate? Coffee houses became the hubs where all that sort of stuff happened. One coffee house in particular, Jonathan's Coffee House, which was established in 1680. You see a picture of Jonathan's Coffee House there. Became super important. Over time, Jonathan's Coffee House had to keep expanding, and they didn't have enough space for everybody. And eventually, they moved into some new digs and renamed themselves the London Stock Exchange in 1801. So that's right. The very bedrock of how our economies work today with stock markets started in a coffee house. So the London Stock Exchange, one of the first real modern stock exchange, began as a coffee shop named Jonathan's. And in fact, for many years after it moved into its new digs, people still referred to it as New Jonathan's. So the connection to its coffee shop origins was not completely lost. So another important coffee house for business was Lloyd's Coffee House, which opened on Tower Street in London in 1688, founded by Edmund Lloyd. So Lloyd's Coffee House became a really important place for sailors and merchants and ship owners, and Lloyd catered to them with reliable shipping news. So shipping, in the 18th and 17th century was obviously a risky business to be in. Ships weren't that great and they frequently sank. And so, if you were in the shipping business, it was really important to know what was going on. So who was importing what, when would it come into port, et cetera, And also, the problem with shipping, of course, is that it's very expensive. You invest your life savings, say, in bringing in a shipment of cotton from the Americas, and then suddenly your ship sinks. You could lose everything. So it's in places like Lloyd's Coffee House, you might actually take steps to, get people to help you out in case you were going to take on the risk of bringing in something. You might find people who might be willing to cover your loss. And so someone might say, hey, I think you've got a pretty strong ship. I'm willing to bet that your ship is going to come in. So if you pay me $100, then I will cover your loss if your ship actually doesn't come in, if it actually sinks. And if it does come in, then I just keep the $100. This was the beginning of insurance. The concept of insurance begins in a coffee house, insuring ships as they come into port. So Lloyd's Coffee House is still around. It's now known as Lloyds of London. What had begun informally at Lloyd's Coffee House as insurance amongst merchants formally became the Society of Lloyds in 1774. And just, to give you an example, Lloyd's is like one of the biggest insurance companies in the world now. And in 2018, it held 53.5 billion pounds worth of assets. So they're not really in the coffee business anymore, but they still exist. So Lloyds of London, which if you were in the UK, you'd know all about Lloyds of London. I mean, it's huge. It's the big insurance company. Begins in a coffee house. And in fact, the very concept of insurance, so when you're paying your car insurance or whatever other insurance you have, that idea began in a coffee house. So as I was saying, all the major thinkers of the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, they all went to coffee houses, including Voltaire, who you see here. Voltaire used to brag that he drank 50 cups a day. I don't know how that's possible. It sounds rather dangerous, but that's what he said. JeanJacques Rousseau said, "I love that perfume when they roast it in my entryway. Some of my neighbors closed their doors, but I opened mine." Also a big fan of coffee. And the American Revolution was planned in coffee houses. We wouldn't have the American Revolution. We wouldn't have a United States of America right now if it wasn't for coffee houses. The British knew this. They called American coffee houses seminaries of sedition. That is, schools where you could learn to be a revolutionary. George Washington and all of his crew, they planned the revolution essentially in coffee houses, particularly one coffee house, the Old London Coffee House in Philadelphia, which you see a picture of here. So, the fact that we have to our south, the country, the United States of America, is the result of coffee. Finally, the French Revolution would not have taken place if it wasn't for coffee houses. The French Revolution is what we've been building for in this course the entire term. It is, for many historians, a demarcation point from which we now enter into the modern world. Well, according to legend, the French Revolution actually was launched when this man, Camille Desmoulins, was having a cup of coffee in the Café de Foy on July 12, 1789, and news came that the king had fired the economic minister who everyone loved and was very popular, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. He jumped up onto his table, he kicked his coffee over, and he yelled, "Two arms, two arms!" And everyone else ran out into the street yelling, "Two arms, two arms!" And the French Revolution had began. That's right, you heard it here first. The French Revolution began in the 18th century equivalent of Starbucks. So I hope I've convinced you just how important coffee is to the modern world. Now, there are so many social and political consequences of the Enlightenment, but one of the most important, I think, is the rise of this concept called public opinion. The idea that governments should care about public opinion, that they should be responsive to public opinion, is really an idea born out of the Enlightenment. And it happens because there is now this emergence of a new reading public. More and more people are literate than ever before. There's a greater number of books available. There's now newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets, which are all being sold. This fundamentally is a shift that is happening at the societal level that is a result of the Enlightenment. So as I had indicated at the beginning of the lecture, there actually were a few rulers in Europe that actually were not entirely hostile to the concepts of the Enlightenment. And this is where we get the term enlightened monarchy, or the idea of an enlightened despot, an enlightened despotism. This is the idea that you have a ruler who has taken much of the ideas of the Enlightenment and allowed society to change beneath them, but they themselves remain in power. So one example of someone who was at least receptive to the Enlightenment is the leader of Prussia, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great. He considered himself, or considered the monarch rather, as the first servant of the state. Now that sounds a lot like John Locke's idea of the social contract. And so you do see some leaders that are responsive to the ideas in the Enlightenment. As long as they stay in power, as long as they have full power, then you do see, a little bit of a nod towards the Enlightenment. A despot is just someone who is all powerful. So an enlightened despot is a slightly nicer version of a despot. Another example of a leader who is responsive to the Enlightenment is Catherine the Great in Russia. So Catherine actually wrote a book which was inspired by the Enlightenment called Instruction or Instructions. And in it, she basically argued that law should be supreme, not necessarily the leader, and that people should be equal to a degree underneath the leader. The leader, though, still remains the leader. The leader still remains all-powerful. Also, Catherine was interested in many of the other ideas in the Enlightenment about efficiency and organizing governments to be more modern in many, many respects. But, we still see in Russia that they had serfdom. So Russia is, a whole case study in irony, I suppose, and that you do have people like Catherine the Great and also Peter the Great as well, who we talked about in the last lecture. He was also, to a degree, also inspired by some ideas in the Enlightenment. And at the same time, we just have these old, archaic structures, legal structures such as serfdom, continuing at the same time. So Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great of Prussia, these are two examples of quote-unquote enlightened monarchs. So in conclusion, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment represented a fundamental shift in the European worldview. Growing Enlightenment criticism underlined absolutist power, especially in France. And the seeds were set now for a century of revolution in the Western world.
In our next unit, we'll be exploring the French Revolution and the birth of the modern world. Spoiler alert, it's got plenty of blood, guts, and gore. See you in the next unit.